In this first podcast of a couple of them, I will be talking about primary sources for Second Temple Judaism. So here I'm just going to focus in on biblical and non-biblical text, or some specific non-biblical text. So we'll look here first of all. Obviously, the first most important thing to be familiar with for Second Temple Judaism is both the Hebrew and the Greek Old Testament. So you see after the word Greek here, I have LXX. That is the designation that is used for the Septuagint. Um, and the reason why, if you're familiar with your Roman numerals, 70, because there was a tradition that went along with the Septuagint that when the scribes were translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek, that there were 70 or 71 of them, and within 70 or 71 days, they were able to translate these into Greek, and it was miraculous, and there wasn't any um, disagreements between the translators about how it should be done. So anyway, very oftentimes LXX is designated for the Septuagint. So there are primarily three divisions that would have been thought of by many Jews for the Old Testament. And of course, note that I will say many and not all. You need to always remember that there's so much diversity amongst Jews. We can't really talk about all Jews having the same view. But many Jews would have thought of both Torah, that is the law, the first five books in our kind of Protestant Bible, or the Christian Bible, is known as Torah, or the law, prophets, and the writings. Sometimes you might see this collection described or referenced as Tanakh. And so the T stands for Torah, the N stands for Nevi'im, which is prophets, and Ketuvim, which is writings. So Tanakh will sometimes be used to refer to these. So basically, three divisions. Their authority was acknowledged sometimes by the rabbis with the description of that which defiles the hands. So that may sound kind of odd to talk about certain writings that defile the hands. But what that means is that both kind of before one touches these, the scrolls of this work, or after one touches these, you are to ceremonially wash your hands. So there's something kind of holy or distinct about these books as opposed to other books. These books convey something of the sacred story of God's work with his people, and these books contain something of God's will for his people, both in how they ought to live in kind of covenant loyalty with God, and also what God is going to be doing in the world. So they hold a special place. Certainly those who want to read the New Testament should be very familiar with the Septuagint, because we find that frequently New Testament authors are utilizing the Septuagint. So for Jews who primarily speak Greek, or Greek is their major language, the Septuagint could have been a popular, or would have been basically their Bible. It would have been their scriptures. So becoming familiar with the Septuagint. So sometimes you'll see that the Septuagint version will slightly differ at times from the Hebrew, and being aware of those differences and what those differences might mean plays a role in how we interpret the New Testament. And there are three forms of the Hebrew. There's what we call the Masoretic text. So this term Masoretic comes from a Hebrew word that refers to the Masoretes, the scribes who copied the Hebrew Bible. And So this tradition of these particular scribes and passing on primarily for Jewish communities the uh, Hebrew Bible is referred to as the Masoretic text. So today, most English translations of the Old Testament is based off of the Masoretic text. Our oldest Masoretic text come from somewhere around the 10th century CE. There's also the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there's also the Samaritan Pentateuch. So the Samaritans are a kind of a group of people who lived at the time that Jesus lived even before that time. They lived in an area designated as Samaria. They have a Pentateuch. This Pentateuch, first 5 books, um, the books of Moses read differently than the Masoretic text. So it's interesting sometimes to compare what is in the Samaritan Pentateuch as opposed to what's in the Masoretic Hebrew text. And so the Dead Sea Scrolls was very important find. I'll talk about them in a separate podcast. But when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, that advanced our knowledge of Hebrew texts of the Old Testament by, a number of years, over 1,000 years. So those are important evidence then for the kinds of things that were thought of as scripture, or the special collection of books that help to define Jewish faith, or interpret it for defining Jewish faith. Some particularly important books in the Old Testament for reconstructing Second Temple Jewish history and behavior. Books like Ezra, which was probably completed somewhere around 400 BCE, recounts the return of exiled Jews to Jerusalem as they restore pre-exilic institutions and conform religious practices to a particular interpretation of Torah. So this is a interpretation of Torah, interpretation of the law that is from these people who had been exiled, living in Babylon, living under the Persians, now then being permitted by the Persians to come back to this kind of ancestral region to colonize it, basically. And as they are doing so, they have an interpretation of Torah that they are mandating, requiring. And so the book of Ezra is important for understanding from the author of Ezra his perspective of what is taking place or should take place. Of course, Nehemiah as well. So Ezra and Nehemiah are two. And it's depicting kind of the third stage of reconstruction of Jerusalem under Nehemiah, who was kind of sent by the Persians to be involved in this reconstruction. Of course, the reason why the Persians are allowing for Jerusalem to be reconstructed is not out of some kind of warm-hearted feelings for these people, but Jerusalem could become a fortified city as the Persian Empire, is reaching farther afield. Having places that are fortified is beneficial militarily for the Persians. So having these colonists, as it were, living in this area in a fortified city is helpful to the Persians. Daniel is also another very important book because Daniel is a part of sanctioning Jewish sages in foreign courts, teaching that prosperity and protection follows faithfulness. In the book of Daniel, this will be kind of controversial for some, but the book of Daniel was most likely written somewhere in the 2nd century BCE. It wasn't written by a guy named Daniel who lived in, Babylon. So it's written using Daniel as a character, and then talking about Daniel and his visions. It's an apocalyptic work to decode, as it were, to provide insight into the experiences that are occurring in the, um, you know, around 150, 160, 170 BCE. And so it's important to see Daniel as this work that was written during this time of Hellenization of, of Judea. So another source that's important for people to become familiar with is the Apocrypha. So the Apocrypha are collections of books that were written in Greek, so they belong to the Septuagint. But we don't have evidence that they were originally written in Hebrew. So they kind of stayed separate from the books that were kind of included amongst books that had a history of being written in Hebrew. So amongst the Apocrypha, we find stories of both biblical and early post-biblical times. So Susanna, Bel and the Dragon, Tobit, Judith, Third Maccabees. Again, you can see the kind of the dates for the writings of the Apocrypha. So from 317 BCE to about 100 CE. So all during this time, there are Jewish authors who are writing, telling stories, but these stories then help to express something of what the author sees as appropriate behaviors of legendary figures or heroines, and so they help to provide a narrative from which people can construct their faith. There's also parts of the Bible that are kind of rewritten and explained. We have additions to the book of Esther. We have something called the Baruch. So Baruch was a scribe of Jeremiah. We have a work called the Letter of Jeremiah. We have the Prayer of Azariah. We have Psalm 151. So we have additions, as it were, to the Hebrew Bible, but these things were written in Greek. We also have historiography, so kind of a telling of things that are happening amongst the Jews. So First and Second Maccabees. We're going to talk more in another podcast about the Maccabees and this family that arose and sought for kind of a religious independence from a Greek king, a Greek emperor by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. And First, Second Maccabees kind of gives a history from one perspective of how this was done and how they were, empowered by God or overseen by God to do this thing that brings about, a community of people who will pledge themselves to be faithful to God. So these First and Second Maccabees, the historiographies, as well as something called First Esdras, or sometimes known as Third Ezra. Also in the Apocrypha, we have things that are called apocalypses. So apocalypses are visionary experiences, something that's been mediated, as it were, to a human being through some kind of divine agent. And so we have an example of an apocalypse. We have example of wisdom material. So Ben Sirach, Wisdom of Solomon. We have Fourth Maccabees. So that's kind of in the genre of wisdom material. We also have prayers. So the prayer of Manasseh is an example of that. So lots of different kinds of things representing the Apocrypha. One last one that I'll talk about here briefly as an important primary source in this first podcast is the Pseudepigrapha. Again, notice the dates here between 200 BCE to about 2nd century CE. We have books like First Enoch, hugely influential book. These books were not just written by one author at one sitting. These are collections of writings that span over several bits of time, and so there was this kind of Enoch tradition. And so this material is quite helpful as we get into some of the languages and some of the images, especially thinking about eschatological matters, what God is going to do, in time, and how God is operating through celestial beings. So First Enoch is an important source. We get a work known as the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. So basically, a testament is kind of like think of it like a last will and testament. It's like someone writing down, as it were, their final word to followers or to disciples or to descendants, and telling them what it is that they want them to know. So the 12 patriarchs, so 12 sons of Jacob, but these sons are kind of addressing their um, descendants, and they tell them how they ought to live in faith to Torah. But again, these are things written in Greek. They're not written in Hebrew, and they are reflecting a view about morality and behavior that has been formed and shaped for several centuries. We have a work called The Ascension of Isaiah, a work known as Jubilees. So Jubilees is kind of a rewriting of the um, the history of creation, um, along the lines of a particular view of a calendar. We'll talk later about the significance of calendars. And so seeing time, how time is seen and how time is expressed through the narrative of creation, and is important for Jubilees. Again, it also contains materials that, once we become aware of them, is important for how we read different parts of the New Testament. So that is just a kind of a hint to some of the books that are in the pseudepigrapha, and we will leave it with that. And in the next podcast, I will look at additional primary sources for Second Temple Judaism.